this incredible story started with a simple text message. Seth Jackson thought, his ex-girlfriend wanted to work things out. So she'd ask him to, come and meet at her house, just the two of them. It could be really private and intimate, to put their messy breakup behind them and finally move on. But by the end of the night, he would face the darkest betrayal imaginable. And it's all because, well, you're about to find out. So Seth Jackson, in this quiet community of Summerfield, which is in Marion County, he was known for his contagious smile and his outgoing personality, and he just loved to always have fun with his brothers. And Seth was like any other kind of 15-year-old boy. He spent his days just hanging out with his brothers and his friends, dreaming actually of becoming a UFC fighter. And of course, he also spent most of that time flirting with his lovely crush at that time, who was Amber Wright. But as it often happens with teenagers, relationships at that stage of your life become kind of messy. And what started as a whirlwind of romance between Seth and Amber quickly soured out. And it led to nothing but, jealousy, accusations, and eventually heartbreak. And that is when their relationship took a very dark turn in March 2011. After Seth discovered that Amber had been seeing another boy on the side, an 18-year-old named Michael Bargo. Now, no one at that time could have predicted that this high school love triangle would end up being the backdrop for the most craziest thing this town might have ever gone through. And it sent shockwaves through Bellevue. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard many times about these teen dramas that might escalate into a deadly plot. But have you really ever heard one like this? Well, I guess you're about to find out. Okay, so the breakup between Seth and Amber, it wasn't just messy, it was completely toxic. Of course, fueled by jealousy and anger, they started, taking jabs at each other publicly, of course, online, now that we have Facebook and other stuff like that. And this is where they used as a battleground, Facebook. And the heated exchanges between Seth and Amber, caught the attention of Michael Bargo, who was already, nurturing this intense hatred for Seth. In fact, Bargo actually believed for some reason that Seth had abused Amber. And he became fixated on the idea that Seth had to be eliminated. But of course, Bargo wasn't just content harboring these feelings quietly. No. Instead, he began, recruiting others to help him execute this sinister plan. I mean, first he convinced Amber, of course, along with her brother Kyle Hooper, who was only 16 years old. And then this other 20-year-old named Justin Soto, and a mutual friend of theirs named Charlie Eli, who was 18. And he recruited all of these people to join him in a scheme that would culminate in Seth's death. I mean, you can imagine as a 16, 17, or 18-year-old in high school when somebody's like, oh, I hate him, I just want to kill him, and your friend's like, yeah, totally, you need help? But you never really think it's actually going to go that far, do you? And Bargo was determined to set up a trap inside of a house, have Seth Jackson come inside that house, and make sure that Seth Jackson never left that house. So in the days leading up, the group, schemed and plotted their little plot. And with Amber as the key point to their plan, she knew exactly how to kind of lure Seth in by preying on his emotions. So her text message to him was very, very simple. All she said is, I want to work things out. And it was just enough to convince Seth to, let his guard down. Against his better judgment, I mean, he agreed to meet her even though his friends were literally warning that, this might be a trap. And as Seth, made his way to Charlie Eli's trailer on April 17th, 2011, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that, something was actually off. So that's when he took out his phone and he messaged Amber telling her, you know what? If you have me jumped, I will never give you the time of day again. And that's when Amber, of course, reassured him with the sweet words, oh, I could never do that to you. I just want you back. And with that, Seth let his emotions kind of take over, and he walked right into the trap. Inside that trailer, the group was already waiting. And as soon as Seth stepped right inside, he was ambushed. Kyle Hooper was the first to strike, smashing Seth in the head with a wooden object, probably a bat. Seth at this point is kind of stunned and, just bleeding, and he didn't have the time to react before Michael Bargo opened fire with a .22 caliber revolver that he had in his back pocket, hitting Seth multiple times. But Seth didn't die. And in a desperate attempt at this point to escape, Seth managed to, kind of move around and then stumble outside. But his attackers right behind him were relentless. And that's when Justin Soto did his part and, tackled him in the yard as he was getting away. And then the others kind of just all grabbed him and they put him right back into the house. And Seth then was thrown into a bathtub. And what happened next was just truly unimaginable. Because at this point, he's been shot, he's been hurt, he's trapped, he's helpless, and Seth was at the mercy of Michael Bargo's rage, and that's when he was shot again, and again, and again, and again. Each bullet leaving him weaker and weaker. Almost, if you could imagine, I know this is a cruel way to describe it, but in the Mortal Kombat games where the person's life just keeps going down and down and down. But you see, at this point, it's sick because Bargo wasn't even close to being done. His hatred for Seth ran so deep that he wanted to make sure Seth not only died, but had suffered from torture before he died. So he was cursing and then beating Seth as the other members of the group just kind of looked in silence like, okay. And maybe I think that's when one of the members finally realized what they were doing was so terribly wrong. But finally, Bargo ended this torment by shooting Seth right in the middle of the face, ensuring his death. Seth Jackson, at this moment, sadly, was gone. His life was stolen in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. But the horror didn't end there. Not by a long shot. Because now, with Seth dead, the group had to get rid of the evidence. So they wrapped his lifeless body into a sleeping bag. And then they carried him literally outside into a fire pit that was right behind their trailer. And that's when they put some lighter fluid on him and they set his body on fire. And they all just kind of sat back and watched as the flames just consumed of what was left of Seth at this point. And while the fire just raged on, Bargo and Amber Wright went to bed, leaving Kyle Hooper to tend to the burning remains. Such a good friend. So now, hours later, when the fire finally started to die down, the group, shoveled literally what was left of Seth's body, the ashes, the bone fragments, the bits of tissue, into these paint buckets that they had. And then the next morning, the final part of the cover-up was set into motion. Amber Wright's mother's ex-boyfriend, 37-year-old James Havens, arrived with cinder blocks and cables. And without hesitation at all, Havens now helped this group dispose of Seth's remains, dumping these buckets into a remote quarry outside Ocala, Florida. And they believed that by sinking, the buckets to the bottom of the quarry, they could erase all evidence of their crime and make it as if Seth was never here at all, or for that point, even alive. But what they didn't expect is a couple things. For one, a lot of you better know this out there. The truth, like light, always has a way of shining through, even just a little bit. And of course, what they didn't count on was that the truth would unravel quicker than any of them could have possibly imagined. Literally within hours of Seth's disappearance, Kyle Hooper, just ended up cracking under this intense pressure. He couldn't live with himself. He just couldn't internally handle it, so he had to do something about it. So he went up to his mother, and then he confessed all the details of this murder to his mother, because he was just unable to live with the horror of what they had just done. So of course the mother, hesitantly picks up the phone to call police, knowing that her son is probably going to be in a lot of trouble. And then once the police were involved, it wasn't long before the entire group was arrested. And of course, each one of them tried to, shift blame on the other one, claiming that, they didn't really realize that Bargo intended to kill Seth. But it was too late. It was too late for all of that because the evidence that they had now was overwhelming. They had the remains found in the fire pit and quarry, the murder weapon recovered from Eli's trailer, and the confessions of their co-conspirators all pointed to their involvement. In the end, you could say justice was served, though no sentence could ever bring Seth Jackson back to life. But Amber Wright, Kyle Hooper, Justin Soto, and Charlie Eli were all sentenced to life in prison. James Havens, the 37-year-old who had helped them with the disposal of Seth's body, was sentenced to time in prison as an accessory after the fact. As for the prime antagonist of this story, Michael Bargo, the ringleader, you could call him, of this brutal murder, well, he was sentenced to death, becoming Florida's youngest death row inmate ever. And of course the crime, shocked the nation. And even years later, people were just left reeling and wondering, how something so horrific like this could happen between kids barely old enough to drive. So as we can clearly at this point see, jealousy, rage, and manipulation is a deadly combination. So next time your ex-girlfriend tells you, she wants to make up with you, just think about this story and then think, is it worth it? Do you like horror stories? For many, it's the scares, the thrill of seeing the horror brought to life on the big screen. But sometimes the line between fiction and reality blurs in terrifying ways. So if we rewind to 1988, when a seemingly harmless red-haired doll entered the world, its name? Chucky. Child's Play became an instant horror classic, where a child's toy was possessed by the soul of a vicious serial killer, Charles Lee Ray. And the film series followed, Chucky's twisted antics as he wreaked havoc on unsuspecting families. With its mix of dark humor and spine-chilling terror, it wasn't long before Chucky became a household name, joining the ranks of horror icons like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. But something far more disturbing was waiting just around the corner. Because while Child's Play terrified audiences for over 3 decades, what most people do not realize is that this fictional tale of a killer doll inspired 2 horrifying real-life crimes. And these weren't just your ordinary crimes. They were brutal, senseless acts of violence that shocked the world and forever changed the way people viewed Chucky. So out of these 2 stories, let's begin with the first. Our story begins in December 1992 in Manchester, England. And Suzanne Capper was a 16-year-old girl described by many as shy, vulnerable, and eager to please. But she did live a troubled life, often staying at friends' homes just to escape her unstable house. And one of those friends was a woman by the name of Jean Powell. But little did Suzanne know, the people that she trusted the most would become her worst nightmare. Because you see, at Jean Powell's home, a strange group of individuals gathered. It was Powell's ex-boyfriend, Glenn, and he lived there. And so did Bernadette McNeely, a woman with 3 children, and her boyfriend, Anthony Dudson. And there was just kind of this, constant stream of visitors that would come in and out of the house at all times of the day and night. But despite that chaos, Suzanne kind of felt like she belonged there, like this was her place now. But it wasn't very long before things took a dark turn. You see, the group, led by Bernadette McNeely, began harboring strange resentments towards Suzanne. I mean, the reasons for their growing hostility were disturbingly petty. For example, some claimed that Suzanne had taken a coat that had belonged to Bernadette. Others said it was because she had given Bernadette and Anthony lice after sharing a bed. But, whatever the reason, what happened next was nothing short of evil. Because like a day that will live in infamy, on December 7th, 1992, Suzanne Capper walked into what she believed would be an ordinary day. She had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was waiting for her that day. But as she crossed into the threshold of what she thought was her friend's home, her life right there changed forever. Because the moment Suzanne kind of stepped through the door, she could really tell and sense that something was extremely wrong. I mean, even the air in the house just felt really heavy, oppressive, and it was clear that almost as if it carried a secret that everybody knew but her. And really, before Suzanne could even get her head around anything and react, her so-called friends, people that she trusted, turned on her with this aggression so sudden, so brutal, that she could barely process what was going on. And some could say that it began innocently enough though, maybe just a push or a cruel laugh as though it was some kind of a twisted joke. But the joke quickly turned into a nightmare. Because you see, they grabbed Suzanne and they dragged her deeper into the house, throwing her down onto the cold floor as they circled around her like predators toying with their prey. And Suzanne's on the ground and she's just fighting to kind of understand what's going on. She's trying to make sense of this betrayal. But there was no logic in it. There was no logic in their cruelty, only pure malice. So, and this is tough to hear, guys, but that's a warning right now. But the first act of degradation came when they shaved her head bald. Clumps of her long, dark hair just fell to the ground. And with each pass of the clippers, they stripped her of her beautiful hair, but also her sense of identity and dignity. And then once her head was fully shaved clean, they, laughed and kept taunting her, calling her all of these names for no reason, mind you, these petty things. And Suzanne's eyes at that point just kind of watered up with all these tears. But she refused to cry to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But sadly, this was only the beginning. Because her tormentors were not content with just humiliating her, no. They stripped her naked, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. So cold she was that the chill of the room's air bit at her skin. But the true cold came from the soulless eyes of those that once she considered friends. And then the real nightmare began. You see, at first they tied her up, her wrist bound very tightly, cutting into her skin as they dragged her to the corner of the room, where then she would be tortured for the next several days. And like an ocean, the attack came in waves, each one worse than the last. I mean, at first they jabbed needles filled with amphetamines into her veins, sending her mind just spiraling into a state of confusion and fear. And the drugs just kind of pulsed through her bloodstream, warping her sense of time and reality, if you could imagine that. She couldn't tell whether hours had passed by or mere moments. And the pain, of course, from being tortured was constant. A relentless assault on her body and, at that point, her soul. Why is all of this happening? Oh, what? You think I took your coat one day? What is going on? And then the beatings happened, and the beatings were absolutely savage. I mean, they grabbed whatever they could find, wooden spoons, belt buckles, anything that could be used as a weapon just to hurt her and to break her will further and further down. So the belts would lash across her bare skin, leaving these deep welts and bruises everywhere, while the wooden spoons cracked against her bones, splintering with each strike. And she didn't cry, but at this point the pain was overwhelming, so Suzanne's screams filled the room. But no one, absolutely nobody, came to help. They only mocked her pain, laughing at her suffering. Oh, and then there were the burns. Yep, the cigarettes, their glowing tips inches away from her skin before pressing them in against her flesh, searing with this intense heat. So at this point, as you know, the smell of skin just filled the air. Suzanne cried out as each burn left her body marked with pain. But the worst part of it was not the physical agony. It was the psychological torment that they were putting her under. And throughout the endless hours of torture, they played a song. And they played this song on repeat. A twisted, nightmarish track that would haunt her for every waking moment. And that's where the theme of today's video comes in. Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play? By 150 volts, the voice of Child Plays Doll Chucky echoed through the room as this upbeat yet chilling rhythm throbbed in the background.
I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
And of course, the lyrics were meant to entertain. But in this house of horrors, they took on a new, sinister, horrible meaning. And Bernadette, one of the main instigators for no reason, she would lean in really close, her breath hot on Suzanne's ear, and she would whisper this chilling phrase over and over and over again. Chucky's coming to play. Over and over and over and over like a broken record. Bernadette taunted her, saying it with this twisted glee in her face. The words were so much until it just drilled into Suzanne's brain, each syllable deepening her despair. And the sound of Chucky's voice, once fictional, became all too real. It was a soundtrack now that had become pure torment. And mind you, not for seconds, moments, minutes, or hours, but for days. Suzanne's world became a blur of this pain and terror and torment, a walking nightmare from which she could not escape. And in this nightmare, the house was her prison. And the tormentors, who were once her friends, were relentless. And the pain of betrayal might have been the worst thing. But even worse, every single time Suzanne thought that the torture was over and that she had endured the worst that they could possibly throw at her, they found new ways to hurt her, to break down her spirit. I mean, she longed for it to all end, but the end would not come. At least, not yet. Now, I want you to imagine being a young woman or man, early in life, you have everything to look forward to, and you love your life a lot. And for somebody over the course of days, almost a week, to break down your spirit so much to the point where you are praying to God that it just all ends. Imagine how much pain she was truly in. So finally, after nearly a week of unimaginable suffering, the group decided it was time to finish what they had started. So they decided to grab Suzanne and then literally drag her from the house, her body limp and broken at this point, and they shoved her into the car. And she was, of course, at this point too weak to resist. Her mind, of course, way too shattered now to even comprehend what was going on or happening. So what they did, because they're so smart, is they drove her to this very secluded area, far from the eyes of anyone who, might help Suzanne. And once they did this, they stopped right near this little patch of woods. And that's when Suzanne was literally pulled and dragged out of the car, her feet scraping against the rough ground as they took her to a clearing that was right out the way. That's when the wind howled at them and it kind of woke Suzanne up for a moment. And Suzanne thought that maybe this was it, maybe it's over, and that maybe they'll actually leave me alone now because they've beaten me and bruised me, but at least I'm still alive. But of course, Suzanne's optimism was only temporary because they did have one final horror in store for her. Like something you would see out of a horror movie, they doused her whole body in gasoline. The acrid scent was just filling up her nostrils. I mean, she was literally soaked from head to toe, and the liquid was just kind of clinging to her skin
like a death sentence.
And at this point, she tried to scream, but her throat was far too raw from the days of crying out. So her body just stood there and shook in fear as the realization set in. Then, in one single cruel act, they lit a match. And before you knew it, flames engulfed her. I mean, the fire consuming her clothes, her skin, her hair. The pain, as you could imagine, was beyond anything she had ever imagined. It felt as though her entire body was being devoured inch by inch. But even in the face of such agony, Suzanne fought. And yes, this is a horrible story, but if you're still watching, you're going to be glad you did, because this ending is truly crazy. She fought at this point with every ounce of strength that she had left. She was on the reserve tank, but she was still fighting. And at this point, all of her friends had left. And through nothing but sheer willpower, Suzanne literally crawled while her body was lit on fire. And her skin was blistering and peeling. But she ended up crawling, with all of this going on, toward a nearby road. And of course, each movement, each grab of grass and dirt was excruciating. But she refused to give up, because hell had no fury like a woman scorned, right? And her determination to survive, to make sure her attackers paid for what they have done to her, was stronger than the fire that was literally consuming her. And by some miracle, a passing motorist saw her and rushed to her aid. And despite, her horrific injuries, Suzanne clung to life just long enough to deliver a final act of courage. Because in her last moments, she named what happened, and she named the attackers, ensuring that they would face justice for the unimaginable torment that they had put her through. And unfortunately, Suzanne Capper died in the hospital. May she rest in peace. Her body ravaged by the burns that covered over 80% of her flesh. But even in death, she remained a fighter. And because of her bravery, her killers, once friends, were brought to trial and held accountable for all of their cruelty. And Suzanne's story would not be forgotten. And that's why I'm telling it to you. It is a tragic reminder of the darkness that can reside within those that we trust the most. Right there, that's 20 stories in 30 days. I don't know if I can do it. I'm gonna need your guys' help. So the only way you can really help me is to try to get each one of these videos with every part of your might up to at least 50 likes, because I need the algorithm to just bite it one. That's it. But anyway, I appreciate you guys so much, so let's get into the story right now. To imagine that you're sitting at your house completely unaware of anything that's outside, but someone is watching you. They know your routines, they know when you are alone. And when they strike, it's not just to kill, but to destroy. And what if you found out that person that you thought you knew so well, the one you trusted, harbored an obsession so dark that it ended in unspeakable horror? This woman's life was snatched away in a way that nobody saw coming. And by the end of this story, I'm going to ask you a question. Who do you think did it? And when I ask you that, I want you to answer in the comments, because then after that, I will reveal. And I think you're going to be stunned. So the main person in our story, this lovely woman, Meghan Landowski, she had this deep passion for dance, and she was really good at it. I mean, since her first ballet lesson was just as a little preschooler. She had been hooked on this, taken in, gliding across the floor with nothing but grace and precision. And by the time she became a teenager, her talent was undeniable. In fact, she was so good that she earned a spot at Churchland High School, which is a prestigious arts academy in Portsmouth, Virginia. Now, this should have been a dream come true for Meghan, but she found herself, out of her element, missing her old friends, and so she ended up transferring back to Woodrow Wilson High. Still her passion for dance remained unwavering, but her ambitions were clear, that she actually wanted to make a career out of it. And outside of dance, Meghan was everything that you would expect from a happy, well-adjusted teen. She was academically gifted, Her and her family had a large circle of friends who just admired her. But no one could have predicted the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface in that town. It was April 10th, 2008. A normal day, or, so it seemed. Woodrow Wilson High had an early release. And like many of her classmates, Meghan was so excited just to, take a beat, go home, and relax. So this is what we know, that she actually left the school at 12:30. And she headed straight for her family's home in the quiet Simonsdale neighborhood. And once she got there, she decided, to pick up the phone and to call her mother, Angela. And of course, she just left her this cheerful voicemail like she usually did. And it just said,
"I'm home safe, Mom. Love you."
And she was hungry. So at this point, she decided to kind of go into the kitchen and she made a sandwich. But Meghan, while she was making the sandwich, was kind of interrupted by something that was going on outside. And it wasn't anything crazy. It was just, like a noise, just enough to kind of pique your attention. And it made her pause, and we don't know exactly what she heard. Maybe it was a footstep or the door creak. Maybe it was nothing at all. But what happened next was far from nothing. Okay, so fast forward about 3 hours later, so this would be at about 4 p.m. Meghan's stepfather, named Chris Scott, he arrived home. And, expecting the usual warm greeting from his stepdaughter. But instead, he was greeted with nothing but silence. So Chris, at this point, decided, to walk through the house, calling her name, "Meghan, where are you?" And his footsteps kind of echoed through the halls until he came upon a scene that was straight out of a nightmare. Meghan was there, laying face down in the middle of the hallway, naked from the waist down, her hands bound in duct tape. A parent's worst dream. Not to mention that blood was everywhere. It was on the walls, on the floors, soaked into her clothing. She had been savagely attacked. And Chris knew immediately that Meghan was gone. So at this point, he's frantic. So he called 911 with his voice kind of trembling. "There's blood everywhere. I'm literally standing in it," he said. And that's when the Portsmouth police arrived on scene. And they found Chris right in front of the lawn, utterly shaken. And they led him back to the squad car, asking him, to stay away while they entered the house. And what they saw inside the house was horrifying. They walk in and they just see Meghan's body, surrounded by a pool of blood. She had been stabbed over 40 times. And it was clear from the condition of the crime scene that her final moments had been brutal and desperate. But the autopsy would later reveal that not only the stabbings, but also that Meghan had been viciously assaulted. And one detective even said out of all the years that he's been on the job, this was the most terrifying crime scene he had ever entered. So investigators at this point quickly started trying at least to piece together the evidence, because 2 knives were missing from the kitchen. And though only one was recovered, discarded down a drain a few hundred feet from the house, something else they found was very important. And what they found was the killer's blood. In the frenzy of the attack, he must have cut his hand. Not to mention, there were footprints everywhere. These bloody shoe prints that just went throughout the house, leading detectives to believe that the killer had circled the property multiple times before entering. He was literally stalking Meghan like prey before he attacked. But now, it's time to figure out who could have done this. Meghan, didn't live a high-risk lifestyle. She wasn't involved with dangerous people or hanging out in the wrong places or doing the wrong things. I mean, this was a suburban neighborhood in broad daylight. Nothing about this screamed random crime. And the detectives had a disturbing thought. What if Meghan had known her killer and this was actually a personal crime? So the first person they questioned obviously was Chris Scott, Meghan's stepfather. It's standard procedure to, question the people closest to the victim. And while Chris appeared heartbroken, detectives had to be sure. I mean, after all, he was the one who found the body. So as Chris is answering their questions, with his heart kind of breaking, he ended up pointing them into a different direction. A name he thought that they should, go and look into. His name was Robert Hick. and Hick had been a friend of Chris's, a fellow Navy tech. I mean, the two had actually worked together and had been close, so close that Hick had been a regular at their house. But all of that changed one day when Meghan confided in her mother that Hick was abusing her. So immediately, Chris cut ties with his friend, and he even reported him to NCIS. I mean, Meghan was even scheduled to testify against Hick, and his entire career and life was on the line. A strong motive, no doubt, but when police checked Hick's alibi, they hit a wall. Hick claimed that he hadn't left the Navy base all day, and security footage actually confirmed his story. So maybe he's out of the picture for the murder, though he's still in deep trouble for all that abuse. His computer was found to have contained over 200 images of, I can't say it on here, but you can imagine the worst type of things you can find on a computer, earning him an indictment and a dishonorable discharge from the Navy. But despite their thorough investigation into Hick, detectives were kind of back to square one. I mean, who could have done this? So investigators went back and just combed through the scene. They collected over 120 fingerprints, countless footprints, and other pieces of forensic evidence, but nothing led to a definitive answer. DNA from that scene, the blood, that was sent to state and national databases, but no match came back. And then the investigation kind of slowed and months passed by. And by August, detectives had scoured Meghan's circle at Woodrow Wilson High, and they were actually preparing at this point to question students that had been from her previous school, Churchland High, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a new lead surfaced. Believe it or not, it came from a random tip on Meghan's exact 17th birthday, no less, from a school bus driver who suggested that they should look into this boy named Robert Lee Barnes, a former classmate of Meghan's. And Barnes wasn't someone who had initially stood out in their investigation. I mean, he was a talented violinist, considered one of the brightest students at Churchland. And when detectives sat down with him, they were struck by how confident and friendly that he seemed. I mean, he didn't appear to be nervous or rattled by any of their questions. But that calm demeanor kind of waved away a little bit when they asked him to provide a DNA sample. And Barnes said, he kind of hesitated, claiming that he needed to ask his mother first for permission to do so. So the detective said, okay, and they let him go, but making a mental note to follow up. But they didn't have to, because Barnes the next day surprised them by showing up, offering to provide a sample. Yeah, so he just came in the next day, and he requested an evidence bag, and he said, how do I do this? And he was actually chewing gum, so he just, kind of spit the gum into the bag. And the detectives, while skeptical, they accepted the gum and sent it in for analysis. So as the investigation just kept ramping up, the question on everybody's mind was very simple. Who could have done this? Could it have been Chris, Meghan's stepfather, the man who found her, lifeless body? After all, he was the first on the scene, covered in her blood, his voice trembling on that 911 call. Or, have we thought about this, was it Angela, her own mother, hiding something far darker beneath her grief? And what about Robert Hick, the Navy tech who had been exposed for abusing her and had every reason to try to keep her silent before she testified against him? I mean, yeah, his alibi checked out, but sometimes even the most ironclad alibis have been broken. And then there's this mysterious tip from a school bus driver. I mean, could they have known something about this or been involved? And then lastly, what about Robert Lee Barnes, the quiet violinist with a shocking fixation of Meghan, who was suddenly thrust into the spotlight? Could he have harbored this hidden rage that no one saw coming? Or was there someone else lurking in the shadows, waiting for that perfect time to strike? And as these dark suspicions spread, one thing became painfully clear, that someone close to Meghan had betrayed her. But who? Okay, everybody take a breath, take a beat. Things are about to get more intense as well, but let's pause for one moment. If you yourself were in this investigation, who would be your top suspect as of right now? I want you to right now write it in the comments. And I don't want you to cheat. I want you to write it right now in the comments. Pause it if you have to. Tell me if it's somebody who you think I've mentioned, or if it's possibly somebody that I haven't mentioned at all yet. It's all up to you right now. Let me know if you like to get involved in things like this to get your mind going and think for yourself as if you were a detective. Okay, so for Barnes, the results came back quickly. No match in DNA. But there was something strange about the report. The DNA extracted from his gum did not belong to a male. Yep, it was female. Barnes had tricked them. But why? So the next day, Barnes and his mother went back into the police station, and when the police asked him why he didn't give a sample of his DNA, Robert responded he had the gum. And that's when one of the officers slammed the DNA report right in front of his face and pointed to the gender of the subject, clearly marked as female. At this point, Barnes asked one of the detectives to, please close the door. And with that done, he asked, "This happened on a Thursday, right?" And the detectives realized he was referring to the day of the murder. And twice during Barnes's statements, his mother asked for a timeout, and said, she needed to confer with her son. And on each occasion, they went out to talk in their car. And after the second conference, Barnes said he was ready to tell the truth, finally, about what happened. According to Barnes, Meghan invited him over on Thursday. However, when he arrived and, knocked on the door, there was no reply. So he got kind of concerned and, circled the house looking for Meghan. And he found this open window, so he climbed right through, just as any good friend would do. And at this point, right when he got in through the window, he barely set foot inside the house when he was confronted by a masked man holding a gun. And the man ordered him to tape Meghan's hands together and to, kind of rough her up a little bit. And then, to have intercourse with her. And the man then walked to the kitchen and returned with the knife. And then that guy started stabbing Meghan, while Barnes just stood by, unable to do anything. And finally, the man handed him the bloody knife, telling him to, go get rid of it, warning him not to say anything or his family would be killed. And before he left, though, just to be precise, the man told him to hold out his finger. And then he cut it, ensuring that the blood would be found at the crime scene. So according to Barnes, he had walked home after witnessing this horrendous murder. And then he kind of, washed up and then practiced orchestra. He tried to, act normal, he said, because he was afraid that the masked man would carry out his threat and hurt his family. I mean, this was the story that Robert Barnes told the Portsmouth detectives, genuinely expecting them to believe it. For all of you that thought it was far-fetched, well, they didn't believe it either, of course. And they gave no indication of that, though, during the interrogation. Instead, they asked Barnes for a new DNA sample. And now that he could breathe a little easier and that he had now explained how his blood and semen had ended up at the crime scene, he was more than happy to provide it. And with his actual DNA sample, when they tested it against the blood found at the scene, of course, it was a match. Robert Lee Barnes was Meghan's killer. And his made-up little story didn't last for long, because in the end, he ended up confessing, admitting that there was no masked man, no elaborate plot. It had been him all along, driven by this obsessive fixation on Meghan that she never reciprocated. And he had told Meghan about his feelings, and that he really liked her. But Meghan, was just not feeling the same way romantically, and said it would be better, if they just stayed friends. So basically, he was friend-zoned, and that's what tore his mind apart and made him become a killer. And in 2009, Barnes struck a deal with prosecutors accepting a 42-year sentence for Meghan's murder and assault. But one question does remain: why did he do it? I mean, why take such brutal, monstrous action against someone who he said he really loved and was his friend? I mean, Barnes never gave a clear answer. But those who knew him suspected that this obsession simply drove him to madness. So literally, I guess only one question is left. Did you guess the correct killer? Alright guys, thank you so much for watching, but to entertain you for tomorrow, watch this story right here. I got you guys, and you're actually really gonna love this one. I'll see you next time. Cheers.